The Oxford Union is about to celebrate its 200th anniversary. I'm biased. I am a former librarian of the Oxford Union, but it is the apex of prestigious debating chambers. It's one of the earliest free speech unions going. One of its first presidents was William Gladstone. It has hosted countless iconic and sometimes controversial speakers. Albert Einstein, Richard Nixon, in my time, Henry Kissinger went to speak. Before my time, Winston Churchill went to speak, to name just a few. Fortunately, the Oxford Union is independent of the university, as the hard-left, taxpayer-funded student union there wants to enforce a cancel culture by discouraging freedom of speech. The student union has apparently voted to sever ties with the Oxford Union, banning it from the Freshers' Fair. First time such action has been taken. This comes after a number of Oxford University's more snowflake colleges voted to oppose the Oxford Union's speaking invitation this month to Professor Kathleen Stock, simply for her belief that biological sex actually matters, despite the Oxford Union, defending the commitment to free speech and even offering welfare support to those attending. As I said earlier, for the record, I am and was involved with the Oxford Union, so I'm not really pretending to be impartial in defending it, but I think free speech is so important to our constitutional settlement. But I'm delighted now to be joined by a former Cambridge student, an independent commentator, Oliver Riley. Oliver, thank you so much for joining me and for your piece in the Daily Mail today, which I read. You found at Cambridge that because you were identified as a Conservative, I think you were president of CUCA, the Cambridge University Conservative Association, somebody actually came up to your nightclub and hit you. This seems quite serious.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Rees-Mogg. And thank you ever so much for having me on, first of all. The environment in these universities, sadly, it's been quite hostile to anyone who goes against the groupthink. And the very sad thing about this, I find, is that it's hostile in a way which is peculiar in that a minority of people hold the view which dominates. Most students are very apathetic. You just spoke about the Oxford Union there. Well, this year in the Oxford University Student Union elections, the turnout was only about 10%. And they claim to represent the whole university with these very strong and censorious views, while at the same time, so many are entirely disengaged.
And that's a really important point, isn't it? That nobody at Oxford, when I was there, cared much about the student union. As you say, turnouts in elections were low. And it was something you had to belong to whether you liked to or not, and then it claimed to represent you. And the National Union of Students is much the same. It's a minority activity when most students have better things to do.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And sadly, it's the case among student unions across the country, especially while I was at Cambridge. The Cambridge University Student Union took stances on certain issues which were often really laughable. And I just thought it was about time, given the recent developments with Kathleen Stock being invited to the Oxford Union, which is, of course, different and independent to the Students' Union, an important distinction there. It's about time that someone spoke up again, because this silliness doesn't seem to abate.
Well, and that's really important because cancellation seems to me to be quite rare, that it doesn't happen a lot, and when it does, it gets reported and often reversed. And certainly the previous Vice-Chancellor of Oxford was very strongly in favour of free speech. But it's the self-censorship that people like you, when you were a student, they don't want to go into a nightclub and find that somebody is attacking them for expressing perfectly normal views.
No, not at all. And I think it's terribly sad that we can't have a free and open debate, and that they presume their views are beyond criticism, that they are cemented and eternal and are forever. And if you criticize them, it's not simply the case that you're wrong, but you're a bad person too. And it's just not healthy for a clean academic environment.
Well, I think that's a key point. What is the purpose of university if it's not for the clash of ideas? And how can you have the clash of ideas if you're not allowed to say certain things?
Quite right. This is something I really found from the outset during my time at Cambridge. For instance, before I went to Cambridge, I worked for a year at the Adam Smith Institute, looking mostly at domestic economic policy. And upon going up to Cambridge, I sat in one of my first ever supervisions, which is a very intimate, small session with a usually quite renowned academic discussing certain topics. And in front of two other students, she immediately disregarded the Adam Smith Institute to other students who were not aware that I had even worked there as that awful place where you once worked. When you start off with attitudes like this, and when the attitudes like this come from a small selection of social sciences academics, well, it's a pretty bad starting point. I think you'll agree.
Yes, I do, because it seems to me to want to narrow debate, and it's the beginnings of totalitarianism, isn't it? That if only one view is allowed to be given. And you made the very interesting point that the people who hold these views think they're eternal. But if we learn anything from history, we should learn that views that one generation takes as absolutely set in stone and absolutely extraordinary for anybody to disagree with, by the next generation become views that are considered eccentric and marginal, and that therefore one ought to have a humility about the permanence of any political or theological view.
Quite right. And I think this is one of the best things about the modern Conservative Party, honestly.
And you were running QCA. I mean, I go and speak to universities when I can. And I must say, I think the people who have the courage in modern universities to stand up and identify themselves as Conservatives is remarkable. Did you find, as president, that you got lots of people coming to your meetings, that people were willing to stand up and say, I am Spartacus, by way of being a Conservative?
Yes, I did. Lots of people came to our meetings, and lots of people really enjoyed the many events we held. But outside of our meetings, it was quite taboo to be known as an active member of the Conservative association, especially in some circles. Usually I kept it under wraps unless it was absolutely necessary. Well, I did that for a while, and then I just thought, oh, whatever, I'll speak up a bit. And that came with a small amount of criticism, shall I say. In fact, I'll be honest, it was a large amount of criticism, but I have to say it was all worth it because someone's got to speak out.
Well, I'm glad you're bold enough to stand out for conservatism, though I must say, having worked for the Adam Smith Institute and been president of the Cambridge University Conservative Association, you may have found it hard to hide your light under a bushel. Oliver, thank you so much for joining me this evening and for standing up for freedom of speech.